Hello and welcome to the Trauma Resonance Resilience podcast, and I'm your host, Lisa Cherry. And today we've done something slightly different, which we have done before, but it's something that I'm doing a lot more of now, which is where I'm recording the podcast live. And the reason for doing that is that I think some subjects just really need to be spoken of together, and doing a live webinar gives us the opportunity to really come together and ask questions live about what we're talking about. So before I really kind of get stuck in, I'd just like to say hello to people. We've got people from all over the country again, which I just find so heartwarming. We've got B, psychotherapist in Birmingham, Dorothy waving hello. Oh, apparently my hair looks gorgeous. Now that's the kind of message I like. We've got, thank you, Angela, my pleasure for doing this. We've got speech and language therapist in Leicestershire, Melanie. We've got John from Northamptonshire, inclusion officer for mental health. Hi, John. Independent fostering agency, Caroline, freelance trainer and consultant in schools, Nicola Beattie. We've got Anne in London, preschool. Jessica, play therapist and therapeutic social worker. We've got lots of play therapists, haven't we? And psychotherapist, drama therapist, Anne. Hi, Anne. We've got Angela, family worker in Berkshire. Hi. And family support worker, primary school. Callum from Yorkshire, freelance trainer. We've got so many different people in here. We've got Joe, independent social worker, trainee ed psych from Birmingham. Jill from social care. Jill, hello, Hampshire. I remember you. You're lovely. Hilda, supervising social worker. God, there's just so many. I can't get through all the messages. But we've got youth workers, pastoral manager. We've got so many different, we've got Durham's just come up, Yarborough Academy in Grimsbury, pastoral lead in primary, nurture group. Anyway, there we are. You get the scene. We have such a diverse group of people from all over the country who are passionate about this subject. And why are we talking about grief and loss? Because this is a subject that ordinarily, I think it would be fair to say, is one of those subjects that's quite avoided. It's the discomfort around talking about grief and loss is phenomenal culturally, I find. And so I thought, what better webinar to have than actually have a collective, connective conversation and target this not just around parents, but also around all school staff, and what loss and grief means in the context of COVID-19. So I would also like to, because of the nature of the topic, just put some interpersonal safety guidance around for people. You're not in the room. I can't feel the energy in the same way as when working with people in training or offline. So I would just say, have a deep awareness of what's going on for you in your body. And if something feels really uncomfortable and it's bringing up stuff that you're not sure this is the right space for you to be feeling and working with, then just go make a cup of tea or switch it off, or you can do whatever you need to do to make this conversation feel as safe as possible for you. So today, who have I got with me? I have somebody who started off she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, which meant that she knew she would never have her own children. She then went into painting to help her make sense of those losses and find her voice and a new direction. Having recovered, she continued with her painting, but then brought in children, working with therapeutically with children using painting, drawing and writing, which might explain all the art therapists, play therapists and drama therapists in the room. Shortly afterwards, she wrote her book, Isaac and the Red Jumper, for bereaved children, and became a child play therapist. She's a recognised expert in her field of innovative creative play therapy. She's a certified play therapist, focusing her work with children between the ages of 4 and 12, and has been in private practice since 2015. She is also a cruise specialist counsellor, and her area of specialism is in treating children and their families who are suffering with mild to moderate emotional or psychological problems following bereavement. I could go on and on and on. Please welcome Amanda Seyderhelm.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you for that very warm welcome, and hello to everybody in the room. Oh, and hello to, is it Milo?
This is Milo.
Oh, this is Milo, isn't it? Yeah, little greeting there. So I'm saying hello to everybody in the room. I can't see you, but thank you for showing up today, and thank you, Lisa, for inviting me onto your podcast to have a conversation with you about talking to children about grief and loss in COVID-19 times, which is a slightly being like being in a Dali painting, I think, at the moment. And I read a great quote this morning which said that, you know, we're all now living in a Rachel Cusk novel, which I thought was really sort of said it for me, really. You know, never has there been a time where we're looking at things in different ways. And I think my biggest fear about being in lockdown is that we will emotionally remain locked in to ourselves. You know, we're physically locked down. This word is used all the time, but actually we are, I think, at more risk of becoming locked in. So I want to start by just recapping a little bit on my personal story, because it explains how I came to be in this place of doing this work with children around grief and loss. And when I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, I was 40, and it's fair to say I was afraid I was going to die. And there was a 70% chance that I would. But what it did was it pushed me into the first stage of grief without me realizing I was in that stage of grief, which was shock. And I think that was something that we're all familiar with in being in this COVID-19 situation, is that we all went into a sort of collective shock. Now, I was 40 and thought that I had a pretty good handle on being able to, you know, articulate my thoughts and feelings. Turns out, when you're in a shock and you're in a sort of grief process, talking is actually sometimes not the worst thing, but the hardest thing to do. I found talking to be almost impossible, and very quickly found that all the resources I'd had and gathered over my, 40-year life to that point stopped working. So someone very kindly suggested I join a support group, and for me it was unhelpful, because I came away thinking, if I come to this group every week, there is a real danger that I will kill myself if I keep coming back here, because I was recycling something that was keeping me stuck. And I think one of the things I see working with children is that same issue of being stuck. They're not stuck because they're necessarily resisting. They're stuck because at age 4 through to 12, they haven't got the sort of cognitive development yet to be able to say, I'm feeling really sad today, or I'm feeling really upset. So for me, learning a non-verbal strategy of painting gave me access to my story, my feelings, my emotions in a different way. And that was super helpful, but it showed me that that's the sort of first part of a framework that we need to build when we're talking to children about grief and loss. So suddenly things that I was feeling desperate, again, like the grief process, shock, denial, anger, all those very familiar stages of grieving, it gave me a feeling of optimism and a feeling of hope. And suddenly I didn't feel trapped anymore. I didn't feel lost in that cycle of loss. And when we have a loss, like we've all been experiencing, loss of freedom, loss of expression actually sometimes, and loss of safety, I think having something to hold on to, whether it's a page or a paintbrush, can give you a sense of, I'm actually more in control. So it
Can I
gave me a
just come
voice.
in there? Can I just come in there?
Yeah.
Because I'm listening and I so connect with that creative way of expression. And also that lots of people were actually talking about Kubler-Ross's grief model at the beginning of this experience, at those first, I mean, it's 6 or 7 weeks ago now. And Milo will stop in a minute. And I think it's really interesting to think about that creative aspect. It's no accident that I got a blank canvas out and started painting, having not painted since the last time I needed to paint my way through difficult emotions. And there's something in that for me around children and thinking about what has been taken out of curriculum time, when actually these are the skills that we need to support us through that non-cognitive expression.
Yeah, I think that's the bit for me that's been really interesting, is seeing the emergence of creativity. Online there was a program on BBC4 about Grace and Perry's art club. People are starting to get involved in doing things that they perhaps haven't even tried before. So yes, you're right. I think children desperately need to have space and a sense of safety. For me, being in a space where I could feel a sense of security and safety gave me permission to take risks. And I know you're familiar, or really familiar with this whole idea that you can't take risks until you feel safe. And I think when you've had a shock, children are feeling everybody's feeling discombobulated. It's about finding that grounding and that safety, so that before you start talking, that's got to be established. And when I work with children and families, that's the first thing I do, is say, okay, what else has been going on? Have there been any pre-existing losses before this? And I think with COVID, my worry is that we're developing a hierarchy of grief. So we've got COVID at the top, but actually underneath that, we've got all the losses that were there before and actually are being magnified by this experience of being in lockdown. So I'm concerned that doesn't get forgotten about, that people who were struggling, children who were struggling before with their losses and their grief, are now going to have that magnified tenfold, unless they have a framework. And I think it takes a community, it takes a society to support a bereaved child. It isn't down to one individual. So when we're looking at schools and other organisations, it's never down, I don't think, to one person to be that supportive, mentoring voice. It's about the culture and the people who are within that school environment to have, a framework in place, so that the talking is the bit that you do almost at the end, when you've got the picture. To get the picture, to get the children actually drawing and painting, you've got to have had conversations before that, within your setting, whatever that might be, to establish a sense of safety and permission, so that children can come in and go, hey, you know what, I'm really ready now to pick up that paintbrush, I'm really ready to do it. If you give them that too soon, they go,
and I think that's key. I think that's so key. One of the things I do hear people talking about is what children tend to be offered, if they're offered anything at all, is straight into some kind of talking therapy. We need a counsellor. And actually the one thing that actually none of us can do is articulate what's happened to us prior, when we can't actually articulate what's happened to us. So I'm really enjoying what you're saying there about, because it fits in really nicely with being a trauma responsive environment, and a trauma informed school, which is that actually the community is ready for whatever traumas come into the school or come into that environment. And I think that's going to be one of the greatest challenges for schools on children's return, is how do we create those environments that are able to hold the whatever's coming back in. the trauma, the
Yeah.
grief, the
Yeah.
loss,
Yeah.
building up those
Yeah.
friendships again. For a start, where there's been a loss of friendships. I mean, there's just it's such a big task, and I hope that that's really being understood by as many people as possible.
I think absolutely there's going to be a greater need for cohesion of thinking around this subject, you know. And I think what happens when you have a loss is you have change immediately. But what I see missing from the conversation is, as you say, people go quickly from loss, okay, let's talk about it. But in that moment where there is a point at which it's too soon to do that. So I would like to see the conversation shift around being more child-centred, to have a more child-centred framework placed at the centre of that conversation. Because when I look at bereavement policies that are, you know, out there, and you know, Child Bereavement UK have one on their website, which is quite useful, but I think what's missing from it is the idea that children need to be at the centre of that. And very often it can get lost in looking at structures, organisational hierarchy, and actually it's about having a safe space. Now, obviously when you're in therapy, you're with a child and you're in a single unit. You can't always have that in a school, and I totally get that. But I think there's a way to widen that offer so that it is a cultural shift for people to make, you know. And but I think that's where we're at.
Can I ask you, have you seen, I'm quite interested in this idea about a bereavement policy. Have you seen, do lots of schools that you've been in, for example, have a bereavement policy?
No.
Right.
I have yet to have been in, yeah.
Okay, so I think that's a really, really important takeaway, that, because we do have quite a few schools on here, that having a bereavement policy is a really good start. And we've also got lots of people who go into schools, actually, how equipped are they in supporting that school in having a bereavement policy, or at least a conversation around bereavement, loss and grief that might inform other policies that are around, or help that school create something. Because I'm thinking while you're talking that actually part of receiving children back into school post-COVID, that maybe having a bereavement policy is going to really be something that people could think about at the forefront.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I have the conversation, it's looking at it through, I suppose, an attachment constancy lens. So I say, let's be constancy aware. Let's look at, you know, those issues first, because we know with children aged 4 to 11 that their attachment style is going to determine how they process their grief. Now, we need to understand that going in. Because,
can we just leave that hanging in the air for a moment? Can you say that sentence again so people can write that down?
We need to be constancy aware and look at things through an attachment lens when we are having conversations about what a bereavement policy should contain. That should be at the centre of it.
Because the attachment style?
Because the attachment style determines largely the way a child grieves. So, for example, if you have a young child who's got, let's say, an avoidance style attachment, then there's some work that needs to be done before you can get them, or hope that they would start to necessarily open up about their grief. It takes time. It's not a case, which is in a way my pet thing about, you know, saying, well, you've got 6 sessions to talk about your grief. Wow.
Don't even get me started on the whole 6 session thing. Don't even get me started on the whole 6 session thing. It's taken me years. Don't even get me started on the whole 6 session thing. Sandra's raised a really good point, and I will be taking questions, which we'll be doing in a little while. There is a Q&A place where you can place your questions, but I do want to bring in Sandra's point, because actually it's about the triggering that I think you've been talking about, that children, young people may well be feeling, the loss sitting on top of the loss, sitting on top of the loss, So we've also got to consider then the adults in the room. So what Sandra's raised is, of course, that there'll be a number of teachers who are also in that layering of loss and those things that are going on and that triggering process. Yes, do please pop stuff into the Q&A. We'll stop at around 11:05 and start answering your questions. So could I just, but I did feel that that's a really important aspect, that because we're only as good a practitioner as our own wellness, aren't we? And if let's just say we are in an environment where grief and loss and coming back post-COVID and trauma and attachment and all of those things are not a space where that they are very well understood, then that's going to be as challenging, as difficult, and as damaging for the staff as it is for the children.
Well, I agree, and arguably the process of, can we call it healing, needs to start with the adults, because if adults are bringing in, let's say, unresolved aspects of their own grief and loss, that may get in the way of being able to support and build a relationship, which is key. The relationship you have with the child and building that trust with that child is key. But if you have your own stuff, let's call it, emotional baggage in the way, that can inhibit. And I know that from personal experience, that there are things I need to work on as a person to take away, to go, okay, that's stuff I need to look at. And my worry, I suppose, with schools returning, is that if adults aren't given that support up front, there is a risk that the compassion fatigue syndrome will accelerate, and that then the holding, the idea that that schools can hold this amount of grief just by having little pockets here and there of support, I think he's underestimating the scale of this issue. So that there are two aspects to this, when you're thinking about talking about grief and loss, it's, well, actually, there's a lot to do before you start talking, and even before you start talking in the conversation, there are two groups of people who need to be supported, and it's the child and the adult. And that, I see that mirrored, in families. It's not just the child, it's the family who need the support. And it's the same here, I think, with it's about having a voice, giving voice. And when I think we've got a voice, we feel more empowered, feel more engaged. And it's having those conversations, at the organisational level first, I think, to build the policy.
Yeah. Just to remind people, there's a Q&A space. If you hover your cursor over the screen, your bottom bar will come up and you'll see Q&A, and you can pop some questions in there that we'll be able to ask Amanda. But yes, I think that there's a real task ahead in shifting how we talk about grief and loss for ourselves, and how we have those safe spaces to do it. What's your kind of experience really previously to this with those kind of conversations? Because you work a lot in schools, don't you?
I do, yes. I think the conversations okay, well, let's just say this. There's 1 in 6 children, there's a child in every classroom who's bereaved. But bereavement is a big, it's a wide spectrum. And it doesn't just mean the death of somebody. It can mean the loss of a routine. It can be having a loss of home, having to move around all the time, not having that safety and that security of a home. And I think those losses are ones that I notice sometimes, I won't say get missed, but I think perhaps don't get as noticed. But the process of grieving is exactly the same. I mean, I'm generalizing it, but there is a process of grieving that goes on for children who've experienced a loss that affects them emotionally, and it, you know, it affects them to perform at school and to be engaged. So I have found the conversation around loss in schools to be problematic, because I think it's as you said at the beginning, it's not a topic people generally want to talk about. First off, loss, grief, because it triggers, it can trigger your own
because
story.
it's all our experience, isn't
Yeah.
it? Grief and loss is essentially part of the human condition. So there's no avoiding it. There's no I've never had that, you know. There's no, it is part of what we live with. And yet culturally there's something really interesting about how we handle it. But I think you're spot on. I think the challenge is, if we talk about it, or if we think about it, or if we put things in place to consider it, we have to tap into our own grief. And I know this week I had a day of absolutely feeling soaked in grief. On the podcast, I wrote a letter to my grandma, and I was literally at the breakfast bar, and she died a long time ago. I was literally at the breakfast bar writing this letter that I was going to read out, and I just felt soaked. And I felt that in the lens of COVID. I thought, this is so interesting that this wave of immense grief is coming up for me right now. What is going on around me? You know, I have those questions about why and when, and I'm interested, I'm curious about looking at that in a context. And I guess there's an element of that as well, isn't there, when we're looking at those other losses and we're thinking about contexts. And the beauty of COVID-19, of course, is that it's a context that it would be very difficult for anyone not to have been touched by in some way, which should, in theory, do you think, make the conversation easier?
Oh, I think it's top of the breakfast table conversation now. You know, it was maybe whispered before, but I think now it's a major subject. It's been interesting seeing how the government initially resisted even having any reference to it, and now it's just started to trickle at very, very little. I don't think the word grief has actually been used in a briefing at all. But I think there's a lot of anticipatory grief as well, you know, that sets up the fear of, well, we've lost people, you know, people have died, but there's the anticipation of returning to school, and that the grief that goes with having to deal with all of the conversations and the experiences that people are going to bring back to school, and how to frame, how and where and how to frame those. I've got a couple of infographics, which I'm happy to share with anyone who'd like to have them. One is how to talk to a child about coronavirus. And then there's another about the 4 things you need to think about when you're actually putting together a bereavement policy, the 4 sort of elements, I've called them, if you like, of that planning process. And it covers all the things we've talked about.
That would be fantastic. I mean, interesting. I will start to take questions in a minute, but one of the comments Nicola's put in here, that actually addressing grief and loss needs to be part of the protocol of returning, and I would agree that actually part of schools returning, and even workplaces actually making this part of what you're going to be receiving back into school. Yes, and those would be shared with you. So you've kindly offered to share those. So I will put your details at the bottom, and people can make contact with you for those. Shall I take a couple of questions, because the Q&A box is filling up? Okay, so how can we now, this is from Nicola Beattie, how can we now reflect on our practice of creating safe spaces with safe adults against the current backdrop where other people and other places might make us ill or cause us harm? That's quite a big question, isn't it?
That's a big question. That's a great question, and it's a big subject. And the first thing that comes up for me around that is, you know, reflective supervision and making sure that adults in whatever working context have access to some sort of reflective supervision. And I know that that's patchy. It's not all available to everybody, but I think it's essential to try and have a space where you can process that. I think returning to work, returning to school, I would, in an ideal world, I'd like no children to go back to school until that's been put in place, until there is a framework, a workable working framework. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be something that, you know, all staff can use and have before they start to see children coming back.
I can't think, I imagine lots of people feel like that. I imagine lots of people feel like they're not having the right conversations, they're not having enough conversations, or they are having the right conversations, or, you know, there's going to be such a spectrum, isn't there? Keith's just actually articulating that thing around loss, not necessarily about death. It's about the loss of routines, relationships, friendships, potentially the loss of parental support and connections when returning to school. And Keith has called that, linked that to the idea around separation anxiety. And I think that's a really interesting one, because I imagine there are going to be lots of children who are quite frightened about coming back, and also parents frightened about coming back, especially if they've had a big loss or an actual bereavement that they have all supported each other with. Because lots of people, particularly in the Southeast and around the West Midlands, will know someone who has died or nearly died. Because let's not remove the potential of getting in touch with those feelings of loss through people who have nearly died because they've been in hospital with COVID-19. I think that's something I'd like to think is thought about. But yes, if you've been a family that has been very supportive of each other and you're now going to be separated, that's also potentially an interesting one. So thanks for Keith.
It is. I think it also raises the question of being age appropriate, always being age appropriate in response. So just imagining that scenario where a family is separated, I always think of that as, you know, what needs to be decanted at the end of that experience. So whether you've been to hospital and you're coming home, what needs to be decanted? How does it need to be decanted? But for sure it does. And providing those age appropriate materials so that children can do that at home, whether it's, okay, sitting down for 15 minutes and just doing some drawing, or whether it's for adults being able to feel it's okay to have a conversation if that's what they want to do with someone outside the home. I mean, personally, when I was going through cancer, I didn't find it helpful to talk to my family about any of this. I needed to find an external support because I didn't want to say, I'm scared I'm going to die. So, but you have to say it, I think, at some point in order to externalize it so that you can deal with then the emotion that comes from that reality that's there. Suddenly you've said it. So I think it's a very interesting question. Yeah.
And how many, I mean, you know, I'm kind of, people who listen to my podcast know that I kind of get quite deep and personal on these things. And while you were talking, I was thinking about how many of us have actually thought, I'm scared I'm going to die. I mean, really, if you just, if all the people listening, just for a moment, just ponder, how many people have thought, I don't want to die yet. I don't want to get this because I don't want to be that person on a ventilator, you know, or prior to being on a ventilator, who's on a social media thing with my phone up going, I'm telling you, you don't want to have this. And then the next day there's a thing saying, I'm really sorry, this person, I mean, so that in itself is, must be coming up for so many of us. And then of course there's the denial. I mean, there's You know, I've spoken to
Yep.
people who said people are making such a fuss. You know, so we really do have that. So even though something hasn't happened, the anticipation of something happening and how that changes us and alters us and changes the way we think about our place in the world is part of this conversation, isn't it?
Well, it is. And I think it's shifting everyone's narrative around how they thought things were going to be. Suddenly there is, you know, someone's thrown a boulder at us and it's just shattered everything. Nothing is as we thought it was going to be. And it's dealing with that realization that we are all grieving, whether we are in denial one day or when we are like children, you know, they puddle jump through their grief. They don't always stay in the sadness or in the anger. They can be puddle jumping in and out. And I think as adults, we can too. But it's for sure, it's all a grief.
And that's difficult for people, isn't it?
Very.
There's a social construction about how we're supposed to grieve, isn't there? You know, and the internal conversations about, you know, should I be happy? Why do I feel okay today? Is it okay for me to feel okay today? What will people think if they see me out being okay today? And children don't have that noise going on. They are just going through their grief process without that secondary awareness of, well, how am I supposed to be feeling? What am I supposed to be doing?
Yeah, I remember working with a particular family, a little boy, I think he was 7 at the time, when his mum died. And at the funeral, you know, his father was horrified and said to me, why is he running around, you know, sort of looking like he's having a great time? This is really offensive. Everybody's upset. And I said, well, actually, that's his way of coping with the fact that his mum has just died. You know, it isn't always going to be a head-on confrontation. And I think you're right. We need to prepare for all sorts of reactions that we weren't expecting. And I think there's a real chance that we might regress as well, that there's a regression to, you know, those places in our own childhoods when we didn't feel as safe as we do, and as we've worked hard to feel safe now, we may be triggered back into that space of, actually, you know, this reminds me of a time when I didn't feel safe. Even if no one's actually died, you don't have to have a death. It can be, well, my way of life's changed. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got another question here. And actually, this came in on email from Joe, and I've just seen another comment from Joe as well. What about the issue of children where there's been bereavement through suicide? How much is right to share with them? So I know that Joe's an independent social worker, so there might be other people also working around that. Well, how much is right to share with them at different stages? What wording is best? Maybe it's only in my practice that this issue has increased a lot due to COVID and has touched my personal life as well. So I'm really keen to see if I'm on the right track, if there is one. So that's a great question. Do you have any thoughts about that?
It's a great question, Joe. And I think the clue to that is in your final question at the end, you know, if there is such a right way. I would say 2 things in response to that. One is to direct you to the child bereavement website. They will have a link on there about suicide, dealing with grief from suicide. I know there are some things that are important to establish in terms of boundaries and safety around what you do say, but I think and I think it's important to be guided by your own intuition around what you think is safe to share and what isn't. So I don't know whether that's helpful, but I think there are certainly what I would call a classic response, which is worth checking out, to just get a sense of, because suicide is not my area of specialty, so I don't want to say anything here and be out of line, but also to reassure you that I think it's important also to check in with your own intuition around what you feel is safe to say and what is not safe to say. I would always err on the side of not oversharing in something like that until you yourself feel safe with the information. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's the guidance, is not to overshare.
Okay, that's fantastic, Amanda. Thank you. John has asked about the relationship being the key factor. I mean, I hope we've kind of made reference to that. I mean, absolutely, which is why relationships are everything in school. And that's certainly something I bang on about a huge amount, because you know, these are conversations, and that's something to think about. John, thanks for raising that, of course, because where we've got transitions, and children might well be going into schools where they don't know the teachers. I mean, we've yet to know what that transition path is going to look like. That came up in the webinar the other week. But if those relationships aren't there, then part of that receiving back into education has to be around how to ensure that there is some building of relationships that are coming in a deeper way than we'll visit the school for half a day, which I've always found intriguing. So thanks for that, John. What thoughts do we have about the best way to support adults with grief, you know, as a whole school staff that's outside of the bereavement policy? I mean, my thoughts about that are that in the writing of a bereavement policy, if that can be done collectively, then that opens up some opportunities to navigate any support needed. Would you say, Amanda, or any other ideas?
I would. I think at the heart of any bereavement policy, there has to be a shared understanding, a shared buy-in to it being an empathic framework.
Yeah.
So an empathic framework means that there has to be, you know, buy-in from individuals into what that actually means and what it looks like. And I'd like to see more of that, so that we don't see anything. I'm going to put this tactfully. What we see is that when children are struggling with their grief, that there is a way for them to be responded to in an empathic way that supports that process, rather than, you know, they may be excluded because their behaviour is outside what's expected of them at that time, and which will help with building an empathic framework around what that looks like. I don't know whether that answers the question. Does that help? Yeah,
well, I mean, I think that's all part of that whole thing about, can we be really curious about the behaviour in front of us and actually develop that awareness about behaviour as communication? I mean, I would imagine most of the people that are listening to this are already from that starting point because they're interested in listening to this. But, you know, there will be other people for whom the behaviour is not seen as the communication, and the curiosity isn't there. And so that's when the punitive stuff kicks in. But actually what all of us, I'm sure, would be urging schools particularly to do, and parents, is to be much more curious and build in that curiosity for when children are presenting in ways that are challenging. So Sandra, oh, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I think that it's helpful for I'm doing this because the framework for thinking about grief and loss is that it does mirror change. So you have loss, you have change, you have an opportunity to create resolution and therefore resilience. And I think having an understanding of what grief and loss looks like in terms of framework helps people. That's where I can put that in the bereavement plan. There needs to be that sort of understanding that this is a process. It will go round and round. It isn't a linear process, and I think sometimes that can get lost. So just because you've come out of denial and you've found some resolution doesn't mean that you won't go back in again.
Yeah.
And it's that understanding that this is cyclical. So yeah.
Yeah. B. Hughes asks a great question, which is around cultural differences in dealing with loss. She's asked, have you had experience of working with BAME families on issues of loss and bereavement, and what cultural differences, if any, have you spotted?
I think that's a great question, and there certainly are, around, not around loss, but around grieving. So the cultural differences need to be respected, and they are very different in different cultures. So that is something else to build in to bereavement, to a bereavement plan. Sorry, you were going to say something?
Well, I was just thinking about, because it's interesting, because I've worked in all sorts of different countries and with different cultures, and I was just sifting through my mental filing cabinet, and I don't actually have anything that I can think of to draw upon around loss and bereavement that I've seen is different in a different culture. So I was wondering if you had worked with different cultures and what you might have picked up that are different. I mean, certainly I'm very aware of the many different ways that we have of saying goodbye across cultures, but just in terms of the actual grieving process, I'm interested in thinking about, well, what kind of different things have you seen?
Well, I suppose for me the most striking difference I've seen is in families, say the Jewish faith, where they sit Shiva for 7 days after someone's died, which is very different from the Christian tradition of burying somebody, not immediately, but certainly quickly. There isn't that period of time where everyone steps back and as a family together sit around the person who's died and take that time out. And I think that I've seen that be quite difficult to be incorporated in schools. I mean, yes, children are given time out, but I think as families, I don't know. I haven't seen that a lot, I have to say. No.
But that's a good example. I mean, that's a good example in terms of thinking about how do you build that into a policy. Well, if a family wants to do that for 7 days, you'd be okay with it. Yeah, rather than getting into
absolutely.
conversations with absenteeism, etc. So I think that that's absolutely vital to think about. How do you build that into a policy?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have what else do we have? So many questions here. Are there established frameworks for helping schools plan how they will enable young people to express their experiences at a variety of levels and in a way that helps them to cope and heal? So thinking about the usual levels of universal targeted individual, which acknowledge that while we all need some opportunity to process what's happened, some children require more support and time to recover. The universal level often feels like it's the bit that's overlooked. I mean, I'll just answer that before Amanda comes in, because that's why having a trauma responsive school, or a trauma informed school at least, really is a universal approach, because it ensures that whatever happens, for whoever it happens, the school is equipped to deal with whatever comes up, rather than the traditional focus of, we need to make sure that those particular children are over there. Because when we have something that captures universally, then you will capture all the children, and children won't then get lost in that process, because there'll be some sort of idea that they don't need it somehow. Does that, I hope that answers your question, Peter, but that's what I was thinking about around that. Okay, so a question around parents. I don't know if you managed to do work with parents, but how do we empower parents more to deal with their own grief and loss and to support their children? this is Angela. She feels that it would be good to help the family environment so that they're better prepared for the return to school. If parents are not looked after, then of course that makes all of our jobs so much harder. And I did target parents as well for this session, so I don't know if we have parents here. But yeah, I mean, do you get round to working with parents, or are you, you know, how does that work?
I work with the family, so I work with the child and the parents, and it's a 360. So I take the view that the child will feel more supported if the parents are able to be involved and engaged in whatever way that the child needs them to be, but also, crucially, in their own development, their own healing, for themselves. I think if that needs to take place, that's really important. But my big, I suppose, point here, great question. Should parents, of course, should be prepared, and the family, the whole family, needs to be involved in this process of grief recovery. But I think it's a question of access, and how do parents access that in the community? Do they do it through the schools? Do schools need to provide that sort of scheme? I mean, personally, I think that would be one point of access for parents that would make it easy for them. I think there are more complicated routes in the community that inhibit that kind of take up for parents. There are lots of charitable, charities providing online telephone support for families at the moment. But again, we've got this disembodied, slightly odd, disconnected communication pathway with that. And I'm not sure that that's the best environment in which to do this kind of reconnection work to parents and families as an adjunct to school would be very helpful, because I see certainly children recover who haven't got access to parents who can do that for whatever reason, and there are all sorts of reasons why that can't happen. But also when children do have that involvement of their carers or their family around them to do that, then it can help too. So, but it's a case of, I think it's a case of access here. I'm sure a lot of parents want to do this; they really want to do the work, but how do they access it?
Yeah. I mean, we're coming to the end, and I have to say I'm really grateful for people being able to, one of the challenges we're all kind of faced with for doing all this work online, of course, is that Wi-Fi means that it can be so much harder to concentrate as we go in and out of Wi-Fi, and I'm just really grateful that we've all kind of hung on in there. I do want to draw us to a close, really drawing on Chrissy and Sandra's points. So Sandra, certainly Sandra's talking about the 2 to 3 days grieving for the loss of a loved one in Ireland. And I was thinking about Ireland when you were talking about that 7 days in Jewish culture. But with COVID-19, that opportunity to do that has been removed. And Chrissy was talking about that in terms of rituals. And I mean, the grief, it's almost unthinkable to think about what the grief must be like to not be able to say goodbye. And I've seen some fantastic examples. Interestingly, so a rabbi, I was watching a rabbi doing a funeral, live streaming the funeral. And what they loved about it was that something like 200 people could attend this funeral from the community, because the person had been such a big part of the community. And I just thought, wow, I hope all faith leaders are busily thinking about how to create rituals that honor that person's life, and also how you support people who have not been able to say goodbye, and what that does to you as a person. For me, I think one of the things I've been thinking about was what I would find harder than not being able to say goodbye is knowing that a loved one died on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just incomprehensible, isn't it? It goes against all our instincts to want to be close to someone. You know, one of the most practical things I think families can do right now is, for children in anticipation of going back to school, is grab a shoebox and grab any box that you've got, basically. It doesn't matter whether it's a tea bag box. Grab a box and encourage your child to start filling it with memories, with little bits of, you know, whatever they want to do every day. It's a way for them to contain this experience, and it's a great tool for adults to do as well. Find something that you can start putting these difficult moments, aspects of your grief and loss, put them in there, and, you know, close it at the end of the day. But we're all going to need to unpack that box at some point, and continue to have a conversation about the best way of doing it. But, you know, hopefully this is a start.
I think that's such a fantastic way to end, and the comments are coming in thick and fast, thanking us, and also John reminding us that 45 minutes of Zoom is quite substantial, and it really is, and that's something we're all sort of learning to deal with through the day. But I think I'd love to leave people with that idea of creating a box, and creating a box anyway. Creating a box reminding you, so that if you are going back into school as that child, you've got that box that reminds you of that period before. Or if you're, you know, there's a whole range of reasons why you might have that little box with all those things that really support you and remind you who you are and help you to feel safe and grounded. And we all need that, don't we?
We sure do.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's such a challenging conversation to have, and I've really enjoyed everyone being so present and bringing so much to the conversation, so much richness, so much humanness, and so much compassion. So thank you so much, Amanda. And I'm sure everyone will be making contact with you. All your details will be underneath the recording.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lisa, for hosting and holding, and everyone for showing up. It's been a real privilege and really interesting to have the conversation. So thank you. Yeah, big thank you.